Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Imagine the gray dawn on June 13th, 1917. A single American soldier steps onto dry land in France, his boots crunching against cobblestones still wet from the Channel mist. This soldier is General John Joseph Pershing, a Missouri farm boy who has traveled further than he had ever dreamed. He's come to lead an army that on paper is less than 200,000 untested men. But before this war is over, he will shape it into a force of more than 2 million American soldiers, the largest expedition in the country's history. But Pershing's own journey began years earlier, back in the oak-lined fields of Missouri. He was the son of a shopkeeper and a homemaker. He learned discipline behind a mule team long before he drilled cadets at West Point. So today, let's follow that path from lonely prairie roads to the shattered trenches of the Western Front to see how Black Jack Pershing forged America's first modern army, and in doing so became the only living man to earn the title General of the Armies of the United States. I'm Chris Mowery, and this is Stories of the Great War. John Joseph Pershing entered the world on September 13th, 1860, in a modest white-framed farmhouse just outside of Laclede, Missouri. He was the first child of John Fletcher Pershing, a storekeeper, postmaster, and a proud Union man, and Anne Elizabeth Thompson Pershing, a former schoolteacher who prized books almost as much as field work. When Confederate bushwhackers rode into Laclede and forced his father to pull down the Union flag that flew over the family's general store, 4-year-old Johnny felt war's shadow for the very first time. The Panic of 1873 swept away the Pershings' savings, and young John swapped his high school slate for a mule team, carving furrows through the red Missouri earth while his father ranged the countryside as a traveling salesman. The dust and debt of those seasons steeled the boy's sense of duty, and a discipline earned, never gifted. At 16, he took charge of Prairie Mound School, a one-room clapboard building where he taught African-American children their letters by day and studied his own textbooks by lantern light at night. This experience was Pershing's first in command, and it taught him that leadership succeeds only when tempered by respect, especially across the harsh racial lines of Reconstruction-era Missouri. In 1882, word came of an open examination for the United States Military Academy. He sat for the test, posted the top score in his district, and 4 months later was marching through the stone arch at West Point, a 21-year-old recruit determined to excel. Cadet Pershing's academic standing was respectable. He was 30th in a class of 77, but it was his uncompromising devotion to the regulations that set him apart. Classmates joked that the tactical Bible slept beneath his pillow. Officers noticed, too, predicting that the tall Missourian, quote, gave early promise of becoming an outstanding officer. Commissioned into the 6th Cavalry upon graduation in 1886, Pershing rode south to Fort Bayard, New Mexico, and then north onto the Dakota Plains, skirmishing with Sioux ghost dancers in the bitter winter that culminated at Wounded Knee in 1890. The frontier burned into him 2 truths. One, that morale hinges on logistics as much as on courage, and 2, that cultural misunderstanding can set prairie fires that no rifle volley could quench. In 1895, the Army posted Lieutenant Pershing to the 10th Cavalry. These were buffalo soldiers whose valor was often dismissed because of the color of the men's skin. He drilled them hard, praised them harder, and won their confidence. White officers and cadets who were less enlightened gave him a nickname that I won't repeat here, but it was eventually tamed into the slur Blackjack, which was one that he bore as a badge of honor because it reminded him who he chose to stand beside. By the time Pershing left the wide skies of the frontier for the more visible stage of a world at war, he had forged an alloy of farm boy stamina, schoolhouse patience, West Point rigor, and frontier improvisation. These became the roots that would anchor him when the winds of the Great War began to howl halfway across the globe. After his service on the plains, Pershing came east as an instructor at West Point. But soon war came with Spain, and First Lieutenant Pershing left his classroom at West Point and hurried south to rejoin the 10th U.S. Cavalry. That was where he felt most at home. At Port Tampa, the scene was bedlam. Wool-clad volunteers milled on scorching docks, mules bawled, and quartermasters searched in vain for rifles that had been stowed in the holds of the wrong steamers. Pershing watched the confusion and resolved that in any future campaign, supply and discipline would march before glory. On July 1st, 1898, he put those convictions to the test. Guiding companies of the 10th through waist-deep water and bullet-shredded jungles, he shepherded his men from every race and region up the slopes of the San Juan Heights. One observer remembered that Pershing was as cool as a bowl of cracked ice, while the shells were bursting at his boots. When the crest was taken, Pershing's buffalo soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and their lieutenant's gallantry earned him a Silver Star. Victory in Cuba brought no rest for Pershing. By 1899, he was sailing west to the Philippines, first as a staff officer in Manila and soon as an infantry commander in Mindanao. There he confronted a very different war against the Muslim Moro tribes. Rather than rely on punitive columns alone, Pershing studied the local dialects, read the Koran, and met influential men at the weekly market, first listening, then negotiating, and finally fighting only when negotiations had failed. His methods culminated in the 1902 disarmament of the Macu Moros around Lake Lanao, achieved with minimal bloodshed and enough tact that even the wary chieftains acknowledged that the new American governor was a man of honor. President Theodore Roosevelt took notice of this, and in 1906 he vaulted Pershing from captain to brigadier general, leapfrogging 862 senior officers and signaling that merit in the field, mattered more than seniority in the United States Army. From the tropical suns of Cuba and the Philippines, Pershing carried 3 hard-won lessons: that logistics underpin courage, that relentless training steels amateur armies, and that cultural respect can spare a commander both time and lives. These lessons would shadow him all the way to France and to the forging of America's first modern army. Around the time that Pershing was promoted all the way to the rank of brigadier general, he also got a significant promotion in life. In 1905, he married Helen Frances Warren, the daughter of a powerful United States Senator, Francis Warren, who was from Wyoming and had served at different times as the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee and the Appropriations Committee. This was also a man who had received the Medal of Honor during the American Civil War. Eventually, the Pershings would have 3 daughters and a son together, the last of their children being born in the Philippines after John was once again assigned to a post there. He was there when rebellion broke out in 1913 and ended up being recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions in a battle during that rebellion. That recommendation was turned down, but eventually Pershing would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the action. After returning home to the United States, Pershing received orders to take command of the 8th Brigade at the Presidio in San Francisco. Not long after this, however, the tensions on the Mexican border began to ramp up because of the Mexican Revolution, and the brigade was deployed to Fort Bliss, Texas, in April of 1914. Pershing went to Texas with the brigade, but left his wife and 4 children behind at the Presidio. He was in the process of making arrangements to bring his family to Texas when Pershing received news that shattered his life. On August 27, 1915, an alarm bell shattered the pre-dawn stillness of the Presidio of San Francisco. Flames from a spilled lantern raced up the stairwell of quarters number 6, trapping Frances Pershing and her 3 little girls, Helen, Anne, and Mary, on the 2nd floor. Only 5-year-old Warren, handed through a window by a quick-thinking private, survived the flames. News reached General Pershing in El Paso. When a friend telephoned to offer his condolences, the soldier who has faced bullets on 3 continents could say only, "My God, my God," before the line went silent. 3 small coffins and 1 full-length casket traveled by rail to Lakeview Cemetery in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Pershing walked behind them alone, the brim of his campaign hat hiding eyes that have not closed for days. When the service ended, he returned to Texas with his son and an unspoken conviction that the unrelenting work ahead would be the only remedy grief could afford. That work finds him sooner than anyone expects. At dawn on March 9, 1916, Pancho Villa's raiders slashed through Columbus, New Mexico, killing 18 Americans and burning the town. President Woodrow Wilson orders a punitive expedition into Mexico, and the War Department turns to Blackjack Pershing. On March 15th, Pershing rode south with fewer than 6,000 regulars, cavalry, horse artillery, and the Army's entire 1st Aero Squadron, 8 fragile Jenny biplanes tasked with scouting the desert ahead. It's the first time that U.S. soldiers move under the gaze of their own aircraft. Because Mexico's railways were off limits to Pershing, he ordered hundreds of vehicles to haul rations and ammunition across 350 miles of scrub and canyon, the first large-scale motor convoy in American military history. By the middle of the summer, 162 trucks rumbled daily from Columbus to the forward base in Namaquippa. Signalmen lash wireless masts from the border to headquarters, shrinking communication from days to minutes. A Dodge touring car shuttles the general among his flying columns, a 30-man mobile staff that keeps him closer to the chase than any predecessor could have imagined. But Villa proves elusive, and politics soon cut deeper than any mesquite thorn. The Mexican provisional government bristles at the idea of foreign troops on their soil, and in May, Pershing faces War Minister Alvaro Obregón across a hotel table in El Paso. The parley ends in half promises, and Pershing's columns are ordered to halt short of Chihuahua City. "We are like a bull with a ring in his nose," he complains privately, "ready to charge but being held by a brittle string of diplomacy." For 10 more months, the Americans patrol empty Sierras, skirmishing with Villa's men and surviving on the logistics lifeline that Pershing has forged. They kill or capture nearly 300 enemy fighters, but Pancho Villa himself slips away, and in January 1917, Washington recalls the expedition. Pershing tells his family in disgust, "We dashed into Mexico like an eagle and crept out like a wet chicken." Still, the campaign leaves a deeper imprint than any headline admits. The trucks, the airplanes, the wireless sets, even the notion of a commander racing at the front in a motor car. These will become everyday tools of the greater war now happening across the Atlantic Ocean. And the lessons of political constraint will steel Pershing's resolve. And when he reaches France, he'll insist on an independent American army answerable to no flag but its own. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson walked into the Capitol and asked Congress to declare that a state of war exists between the United States and Imperial Germany. 4 days later, on April 6, the resolution passes and Wilson signs it into law. The American Army at that moment numbers around 127,000 officers and men, scarcely enough to guard the eastern seaboard, let alone cross the ocean as an expeditionary force. Now, the obvious choice to lead whatever force America can muster seems to be Major General Leonard Wood, the hero of San Juan Hill. But a combination of partisan distrust and Wood's public clashes with the Wilson administration cause him to be pushed aside. Next in line is Frederick Funston, but he dies unexpectedly of a heart attack in February. And so into the vacuum steps the junior-most of the Army's senior generals, John J. Pershing. He's summoned to Washington on May 10th and quietly handed command of the American Expeditionary Forces. 18 days later, Pershing boards the troop ship Baltic with his chief of staff, Brigadier General James Harbord, a lean Missourian who has already proved he can tame chaos with a ledger book. There were changes in Pershing's personal life as well. Before he headed to the Western Front, Pershing had gotten engaged once again to a young girl named Nina, whose brother was one of Pershing's protégés and now served on his staff as well. His name was George S. Patton. Their advance party lands at Boulogne on June 13, 1917. The first full convoy, 37 ships shepherding 14,000 American soldiers, slips out of New York on the 14th of June and reaches Saint-Nazaire 12 days later, dodging U-boats the entire way. On the crossing, Pershing drafted 2 non-negotiable principles. First, American troops will fight as an independent army under their own flag. They will not be fed piecemeal into exhausted French and British divisions. Second, they will be trained for what he calls open warfare, mobile attacks, rifle marksmanship, and initiative at the lowest level, because endless trench-bound slugging matches, he believes, have bled Europe white. Allied commanders scoff. Pershing doubles down. The Selective Service Act is signed on May 18th, and that sweeps millions of civilian names into draft registries. Within 18 months, the Army grows from roughly 200,000 regulars and guardsmen to more than 2 million soldiers in France and another 2 million in stateside camps. 16 of those camps, Funston in Kansas, Meade in Maryland, Lewis in Washington, and several more, rise almost overnight. Each a wooden city of barracks, mess halls, and rifle ranges. Recruits drill with broomsticks until Springfields arrive, study French pronunciation after lights out, and march beneath placards that read, "Speed up, Pershing needs us." Across the Atlantic, Pershing assembles the most modern headquarters the United States Army has ever seen. Brigadier General Fox Connor takes charge of operations as G3, weaving timetables that will eventually dispatch 9,000 tons of supplies to France every single day. Eventually, he'll have Major George C. Marshall on his staff, a 37-year-old Virginian with an encyclopedic memory for rail schedules who manages division movements and earns Pershing's confidence with blunt integrity. Harbord oversees the whole machine, turning Pershing's broad strokes into orders that 1 million doughboys will be able to read. By the winter of 1917, America's imprint is visible from the pine woods of South Carolina all the way to the poppy fields of Picardy. Kilometers of new railroad tracks, a convoy system that submarines can't crack, and a headquarters determined that U.S. soldiers will fight as Americans or not at all. The forging of the American Expeditionary Force is underway, and the hammer in Pershing's hand is just beginning to fall. But the reality on the ground is one that Pershing is going to have to reckon with. The reality is that there are allies. There are British soldiers on the Western Front. There are French soldiers on the Western Front. There are Belgians, and there are South Africans, and there are Australians and New Zealanders and many others. The Americans have to fit into the larger overall strategy. And so, though he recognizes and insists on the importance of an all-American army, for the time being, he's going to have to lay that aside for the larger picture. And so American divisions as they arrive, such as the 1st Division, the one we call today the Big Red One, they're going to have to be plugged in where the greatest need is. In the spring of 1918, a year after Congress declares war, American expeditionary forces are going to see their first fighting. Their baptism would come on a chalky ridge overlooking the French village of Cantigny. At 6:45 on May 28th, the 28th Infantry of the 1st Division rose behind a creeping barrage, swept through the village in 30 minutes, and then clung to its cratered edge through 3 straight days of counterattacks. The price of America's first attack was 1,603 casualties out of barely 4,000 men engaged. But Cantigny proved that Pershing's green soldiers could seize ground and hold it. Not long after, in early June, the Germans lunged again toward Paris across grain fields near Château-Thierry. Pershing's 2nd Division, including the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments fighting alongside the Army's 9th and 23rd Infantry Regiments, plugged the gap at Belleau Wood. When a French colonel advised withdrawal, Captain Lloyd Williams snapped back, "Retreat! Hell, we just got here!" For 26 days, the forest became a slaughterhouse of bayonet charges and machine gun nests. The Marines alone suffered nearly 10,000 casualties, but their rifle fire broke the German advance and etched Belleau Wood into Corps legend for all time. Those early actions showed Allied commanders that though they were green and did make some mistakes, fresh American divisions could tilt the balance on the Western Front. But Pershing continued to insist on an independent American army, and he spent the summer putting one together. By September, he had 550,000 Americans and 110,000 French under his direct command, and a long, festering bulge south of Verdun called the Saint-Mihiel salient was his first target. At 5 a.m. on September 12th, an hour and day referred to for the first time in American history as H-hour of D-Day, a sudden storm drowned the opening barrage, but 144 U.S. tanks splashed forward anyway, shielded overhead by the largest air armada of the war, nearly 1,500 aircraft of the French, British, Italian, and American squadrons. In 36 hours, the salient vanished. Allied losses were roughly 7,000. German prisoners alone were more than double that figure. Saint-Mihiel was only the warm-up. 12 days later, Pershing hurled his first army northwest against the tangled ridges between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched at dawn on September 26, 1918, drew 1.2 million American soldiers, the largest single battle in U.S. history. Colonel George C. Marshall's timetables moved 15 divisions like clockwork, but the Argonne's ravines quickly clogged with mud, wagons, and stretcher parties. To keep men fed, quartermaster units hauled Liberty rolling kitchens, wood-burning field stoves able to dish hot stew to 200 soldiers at a time, right up to the front lines. For 47 days, the forest echoed with 75mm shrapnel and the metallic clatter of French Renault tanks. Rookie National Guard formations staggered. Veteran regulars clawed forward yard by yard. When the offensive was not gaining the ground he expected it to, Pershing called an operational halt to all million men in the formation. He reorganized the attack, brought fresh units to the front, eventually organized the First Army into 2 American armies, gave up control of the First American Army, and ordered the advance to continue. By November 6th, American patrols looked down upon Sedan's rail hub. The German front was broken. The offensive had cost the United States over 26,000 dead and 96,000 wounded, its bloodiest campaign in history to that point. Still, Pershing drove his armies on. Orders were to attack until the ceasefire took effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th, and doughboys were dying almost to the final minute. One artillery battery was still firing at 10:59. Then, as the 11th hour struck, the guns fell silent. Behind them lay the proof of Pershing's gamble, an independent, modern American army that had leapt from obscurity to decisive force in barely 18 months. Cantigny, Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne, names each written in blood, each mile bought by Pershing's doctrine of relentless attack. Together they forged the reputation of a commander and of a nation that would shape every American battlefield to come. Fast forward nearly a year. Fifth Avenue, September 10th, 1919. 25,000 veterans of the 1st Division marched in dented helmets and muddy leggings while a single open car glided at their head. The loudest cheers of all rose for the tall ramrod figure inside, General John J. Pershing, newly returned from France and, in the words of the New York Times, kept at almost continual salute by the tributes volleyed at him from both sides of the avenue. A few days earlier, Congress had given him an honor that no living American before or since has achieved. He was promoted on September 3rd, 1919, by Public Law 6645 to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. It's an equivalent of a 6-star rank, though Pershing kept the insignia simple: 4 gold stars that silently proclaimed supremacy over every other shoulder board in the service. Now, I should point out that since that time, 2 other Americans have been posthumously promoted to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. The first being George Washington, and the second, just recently, was Ulysses S. Grant, making Pershing the 3rd of 3 Americans who have been given that honor. For Pershing's part, his work was never done. Within a year, he submitted a 95-page final report of the American Expeditionary Forces to the War Department. Its pages distilled the horrors of Cantigny, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne into concrete demands: a standing general staff, rigorous joint training, modern logistics, and permanent combat schools. The report also insisted that airmen must do more than stunt fly over parades. The air service, Pershing wrote, existed to repel hostile aircraft and to observe the enemy. Functions that required independent organization, deeper doctrine, and a seat at the Army's planning table. John J. Pershing was a man ahead of his time. He was laying the groundwork for what would need to happen in order for the United States Army to be a modern fighting force. The armor received similar attention. Weeks after arriving in Paris in 1917, Pershing convened a board that pronounced the tank destined to shape future battle and urged creation of a separate department reporting directly to AEF headquarters, a vision that would eventually nurture leaders like George S. Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Elevated to Army Chief of Staff in July 1921, Pershing turned ideas into structure. He knit the regulars, the National Guard, and the newly organized reserves into a single, tiered force that oversaw consolidation of Fort Leavenworth's School of the Line and General Staff School into the 1-year Command and General Staff School, which opened its doors in September of 1922. Inside those limestone walls, Pershing personally selected faculty and visited classrooms, mentoring a generation that would later sign the orders for World War II, names like Marshall, Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, who all spoke of the chief as both taskmaster but also patron. In comfortable retirement, Pershing refused to rust. He chaired the American Battle Monuments Commission, inspected overseas cemeteries, and with painstaking pen strokes, crafted a 2-volume memoir, My Experiences in the World War. His book earned the 1932 Pulitzer Prize for History, proof that the general who wrote orders could also write prose. Pershing's authority still carried weight on the eve of another world war. After Nazi forces overran France in June of 1940, the 79-year-old general took to the radio and newsprints, urging President Roosevelt to aid Britain. He publicly backed the Destroyers for Bases agreement and visited new training camps, telling draftees, quote, "Stay hard, stay humble, and the nation will follow you," end quote. Even as 5-star ranks were created in 1944, Congress reminded the public that General of the Armies Pershing remained America's senior soldier. No living officer would outrank him. He spent his last years in a Walter Reed Army Medical Center suite, lined with maps from the Meuse-Argonne, still annotated in red pencil. At 3:50 a.m. on July 15, 1948, after a second World War, John J. Pershing died in Washington, D.C., at the age of 87. His flag-draped coffin lay in state beneath the Capitol dome before a riderless horse led the cortege across Memorial Bridge to Arlington National Cemetery, where presidents and privates alike saluted the man they knew as Black Jack. But Pershing's name did not rest with him. College cadets who once drilled under his command kept his torch alive as the Pershing Rifles, today the oldest continuous ROTC honor society in the United States. At a downtown Los Angeles park first laid out in 1866, the name Pershing Square was given. The very year the armistice bells fell silent, its palms and fountains reminding passers-by of the AEF's march to Paris. Across the Atlantic stands Pershing Hall on the Rue Pierre Charon in Paris, a former American Legion memorial whose cornerstone includes masonry from the shattered bridge at Chateau Thierry, the site of the Marine Stand in 1918. Toward the end of World War II, while he was still alive, the M26 heavy tank was named the Pershing tank. And in 1958, engineers dropped a code name for the Redstone S ballistic missile and christened it the Pershing, a weapon intended, in the words of Army Ballistic Missile Agency files, to embody the rapid, decisive power first demonstrated by General of the Armies John J. Pershing. But for me personally, I think Pershing's greatest post-war achievement was one I alluded to earlier. It was his work with the American Battle Monuments Commission, his dedication not only to the fallen soldiers who had served under his command, but to their families as well. He once said of the men who fell in France, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds." And he backed that up. Between 1930 and 1933, the U.S. government carried more than 6,000 Gold Star mothers and widows back across the Atlantic to the Western Front so they could stand, if only for an hour, beside the white marble that bears the fallen soldiers' names. Pilgrimages Pershing personally oversaw as the founding chairman of the ABMC. Their footsteps remind us that the victories we have traced here today were paid for, line by line, in human loss. The Great War claimed nearly 117,000 American lives, a number that's too large to picture until we recall a single mother in a black hat pressing her palm against a cold stone. And yet Pershing's promise endures. It lives in the silent sentries at the tomb of the unknown soldier, in the neat ranks of crosses and stars of David from the Meuse-Argonne to Manila, and in every cadet who still recites his words before lights out: discipline, duty, honor. And so as we close this episode, hold fast to the lessons of Black Jack Pershing's life, that resolve guided by respect for those who serve can bend even the darkest hours toward hope. I'm Chris Mowery. This has been Stories of the Great War. If Pershing's story has moved you, please make sure to follow the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who cares about the stories behind the names in the history books. Thanks for listening.